Welcome to norm-referenced and criterion-referenced reading tests. We will be going over the norm-reference test, the Gray Oral Reading Test, and the criterion-reference test, Basic Reading Inventory. Before we start the testing, I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about the constellation of reading and language. This is a model of how everything that we have to process interacts with each other. So this is a constellation of modules, from sensory modules to feature detectors to categorical perception, etc. So the side is the decoding side of the model on the left, and the right side is the comprehension. All right, so let's talk about it a little bit. You'll see that there is reciprocal input and output across units. So all of the lines that go between all of the modules mean that information is exchanged simultaneously between all of the different modules. All right, the first module is going to be sensory input or motor output. So sensory input comes into the system through waves. So those might be acoustic waves or visual waves or other kinds of energy waves. So we're going to be pretty much talking about visual and acoustic energy. So whatever you studied in speech science and acoustics is how sound is processed, and it's very parallel in the visual system. So in the visual system as well, we receive the input as waves of energy. Input goes in through the sensory system, and you can see all the green lines going out to all of the units across the entire constellation. So all units receive the input simultaneously and start processing the input. This is a model called parallel distributed processing. Each unit or module performs specialized functions. So the first module is going to be the auditory and visual feature detector. Just like we have auditory features that describe each phoneme, so we can say that a p or a p is bilabial, that it's a stop plosive, and that it's not voiced or minus voicing, whereas a b is bilabial, stop plosive, and voiced. The visual system has similar features. So these can be horizontal lines, vertical lines, diagonal lines, open and closed curves, as well as orientation. So those are the features of the visual system. This is what children have to use to construct the sounds of their language and also the letters of their alphabet. At the next level, we have perceptual features. So now we have phonemes as perceptual concepts. So now the child learns to recognize the phonemes of their language and categorize those feature sounds that they're detecting as categories of sounds. So you have the b phoneme or the a phoneme or the t phoneme, etc. You're going to do the same thing in the visual system. In the visual system, you start to acquire letter categories. So you start to recognize the shapes of the letters of the alphabet, usually starting with the letters in your own name, particularly the first letter. So you start to form these visual categories just like they formed auditory categories. This is what children have to become aware of, consciously aware of, when they start to learn how to read alphabetically, and that's called phonemic awareness. You have to start becoming aware of the phonemes that are in your language and what they sound like, and then you need to start becoming aware of the graphemes or the letters and how they're shaped, and then you have to put the two together to form the alphabetic principle, to know that the b sound goes with the letter B. The next category or the next module has to do with syllables or orthographic patterns or spelling rule patterns. So now we have to understand that sequences of phonemes are used to form words. D, a, g can be pronounced as a word, dog, and that's an allowable syllable structure in English. In the visual system, you have to learn the spelling rules. So how do I represent those phonemes? And do we have anything, like if it was a long vowel sound, like wipe, then we would have to have things like silent E letters, etc., to represent the phoneme. Okay, so those are the things that are directly involved in decoding, and decoding should lead to the next module, which is content, word, and form integrated to form words. So basically the form of the sound system can be pronounced as in the word dog, and it becomes associated at this word or vocabulary level with the actual meaning and function of the word dog. So saying the word dog should conjure up an image of a dog and then conjure up concepts of what a dog does and what he smells like and looks like and barks like, etc. So decoding ultimately is done in order to recognize words. Words are pronounced and associated with concepts that respond to or correspond to a particular meaning. But meaning isn't expressed in vocabulary words alone. I can say dog day afternoon, and that's a very different meaning than I saw a dog this afternoon. So basically, the next module, or word order or syntax, helps us to understand and communicate the exact meaning of what we mean by the words that we say. Syntax allows us to put words in semantic relationships. So in this example, the dog eats the bone, we recognize that the dog is the agent who did the action to the object or bone. And syntax gives us a tool for doing this. The next module, or the semantic relations, tells us that the meaning is more than just the literal meaning of the words. So if I say the bone is good, then that's an attribution. It tells me how I feel about the bone. So we're going beyond just labeling it as a bone or describing that the dog eats it, and instead going into higher level things like cognitively making a judgment about what the bone tastes like. Similarly, an even higher level judgment is going to be an interpretation. You read between the lines. So basically, if the dog eats the bone and the bone is good and he's looking at the bone, then he probably wants more bones, but it doesn't necessarily say that. You read between the lines. The lines are generally organized within discourse structures. So we don't walk around saying individual sentences. In our conversations, in the stories that we read, in any kind of interaction, we generally organize multiple sentences into some sort of a discourse structure. This can be a story that has a setting, a problem, a plan, and an outcome, or it can be a lecture of factual information rather than a story. So I'm giving you factual information and organizing it into some sort of a discourse structure. And then your interpretation of all of the language all around the constellation is also dependent on prior knowledge and how well you have your prior knowledge organized. That's going to determine how fast you can retrieve the information that you need, how fast you're going to and how well you're going to comprehend something that you hear. For example, if you read something on a topic that you're very familiar with, you've got lots of prior knowledge and you're going to find it very easy to read and comprehend that information. On the other hand, if you read or listen to some information that's very unfamiliar to you, you won't have a lot of prior knowledge. You won't be able to retrieve the appropriate concepts quickly, and it's going to be much more difficult to comprehend that information. So, over the course of this semester, we'll be talking about all of these different modules and levels around the constellation as we talk about language and reading problems that children may encounter. On the left-hand side of the model, we'll be talking about the decoding aspects, which includes the visual and auditory features, the perceptual categories that are supposed to form for phonemes and letters, and how they're supposed to become linked to each other, the syllable patterns and how they're represented by orthographic or spelling rules, the vocabulary, which is supposed to become rapid sight word vocabulary in reading, the syntax, which is supposed to help us read faster and make linguistic predictions, the semantic relations and the interpretations that you're supposed to make at higher levels, the discourse structures, and prior knowledge and memory, and some of those executive functions. All of those things are involved in reading, and all of them critically important to both word recognition and comprehension. Motor output is the opposite action of the sensory input. So the motor output is actually speaking what you say or what you are reading out loud. Or in the case of writing, it would be a writing system, which would be your motor output. So you have to have some way of displaying physically what it is that you're interpreting and comprehending. So with that background, we're going to talk about the GORT 5, or the Gray Oral Reading Test, 5 meaning it's the 5th edition, which takes from 15 to 45 minutes to administer, depending on how good a reader your child is. The examiner's manual will have all of the information about how you should administer the tests, the normative tables, the reliability and validity of the test construction, and a lot of other information. The form on the right is the student form where you write the responses. All of these files are available on Moodle so that you have access to the information that you'll need. All right. The GORT 5 is norm referenced. That means that your child's performance is compared to a normative population. The normative population is collected by the test manufacturers. They have to get children in each age category that fit the demographic information of the United States. So they basically have to get children approximately equal number of males and females. They have to get children, about 100 kids from each age category. These kids have to be distributed across the United States, so there have to be a representative sample from the South, the North, the East, the West, Midwest. They have to have a racial distribution that's similar to the racial distribution in the United States, because this population or norm reference population is supposed to represent anybody who may actually take the test. So it has to have people like them in that normative population for it to be culturally fair. The person's performance can be placed along the continuum from lowest to highest. So when you look at the normal curve, on the far left, you'll see that only 2% of the population will perform at the lowest level on the test, and on the far right, 2% of the people will perform at the highest level of the test. Most people will perform in that middle, where we have the mean, the median, and the mode displayed. So 68% of the people are going to perform in the middle. We're interested in the kids who are 1.5 standard deviations from that mean, or in the lower levels of the test on the far left. you're going to get a raw score by giving the test, and then you're going to need to convert that raw score to a standard score so that we can interpret it along the normal curve. Some of the common scores are quotient scores, scale scores, percentiles, normal curve equivalents, and Stanines, and you can see some of those scores and how they're distributed in the normal curve along that continuum. All right, there's a few complexities to administering the GORT, so do study it before you give it. Be familiar with the test procedures and the stories to be read. Ideally, it should be administered in a quiet room, free from distractions. We will all be in one room, and so it's going to be less than ideal. Establish rapport with your child. Explain the purpose of the test. Approach the test as if it's pleasurable and fun. Be responsive to examinee fatigue. Take short breaks or decide to discontinue if you need to. Use neutral praise and prompts that don't indicate the correctness of answers. You are doing a good job. You're really working well. I like the way you're trying really hard. You know all the answers. So don't ever say something like, oh, uh-oh. You have to listen better this time. Or say, good, yay, that's right, because the next one might be an incorrect answer, and the child will be waiting for you to say, good, yay, that's right. The child reads the stimulus book, and you record whatever they say on the examiner's record form. So if you look on the left, it says Story 1. This is what the child will see. See Father, Father is here. We want to play. Can you play Mother? We can play here. On your version, you will have a record form, and it says maximum words the examiner can provide is 3. So that means when the child gets stuck on a word and you give them 5 seconds to try to decode the word, if they don't, you can provide the word, but you can only do that 3 times during the testing. You can see that there's going to be a place where you record how long it took the child in seconds to read the passage, and you can see that there's a place where you're going to mark deviations or mistakes. Then you ask the comprehension questions and write down the comprehension score. So let's go through this in a little more detail, a little more slowly. Oh, also, use a clipboard so the child isn't watching you score. Some of the kids can get very paranoid if they see you marking something wrong, and they like, did I get that wrong? Can I do that one again? So you don't want them to actually watch you scoring. One of the most important things to do at the beginning of the test is to make sure that you're using an entry level that's appropriate to the child's grade. The entry level means that you don't want children who are advanced readers to have to start with story number 1 and work their way up to story number 4, where they're starting to read more challenging information. If you have a child who's a 6th grader, then basically you start them with story number 4. So you can see the difference between the two stories. So it tells you that if your child is a 1st through 3rd grader, do begin with story number 1, 4th through 5th, story 2, 6th through 9, story 4, 10 through 11, story number 5, 12th grade or above, story number 6. So begin with the appropriate level of story. Very important. Read these instructions. I want you to read some stories out loud to me. I'll give you the book, and when I tell you to begin, start reading the story out loud. Read the story as carefully and as quickly as you can. When you are finished, I will ask you some questions about what you have read. Then you present the child with the book open to the correct story. So while you're giving the instructions, you want the child listening to you and not trying to read the story. So give the child the storybook after you've read the instructions and say begin. set a timer and record how long it takes the child to read the passage. Most telephones have a stopwatch function. And then as the child is reading, you're going to be marking the deviations from print. Now, this is story 4, and it says the maximum number of words that the examiner can provide is 20. So as the child is reading, if they hesitate too long, more than 5 seconds, then you're going to provide the word for the child. All right, when we look through this one, it says 2 girls went to a farm for a visit. There were cows. So the child said where instead of were, so you cross out the word were and write the word where. Pigs, ducks, and 5 hens. The girls, and then the child was trying to sound out this word, and they said gat heard, so they didn't recognize the TH as a phoneme, and they said gat heard. So you're going to draw a line through the word and write what the child, phonetically write what the child said above. The eggs every morning. The farmer showed the girls how to milk a cow. One girl said the milk looks good, but it will be better after it's cold. Then the farmer and the child completely omitted that word, so you circle the word because the child skipped it. Then the farmer, them how to catch fish. The child said hoped instead of helped, so you cross out the word helped and write the word hope. The farmer picked the fat ears of corn. These are called miscues, and you're marking the miscues. In terms of timing, say begin, start the timer. As soon as the student finishes reading the passage, stop. Do not stop timing if you need to provide a word. If the student skips a line, however, do stop the timer, redirect the child to the correct line, and then restart the timer. So skipping a line would be if the child read the first line, 2 girls went to a farm for a visit. There were cows, pigs, ducks, and the girl how to milk a cow, and they completely skipped line number 2. You're going to redirect them back to line 2 and then start the timer again. Providing words. If the child pauses for 5 seconds with no audible attempt to say the word, then provide the word. So if the child is staring at the text, they know that they're not recognizing the word, they're not really trying to sound it out, you wait 5 seconds with the timer on, and then you provide the word. However, if the child is attempting to decode the word, you give them about 10 seconds. So if they're making an attempt, gat, heard, ga, her, ga, her, and you let them go for about 10 seconds with the timer running. Do not count it wrong if they decode the word within 10 seconds. But if the word is incorrect, if it's read incorrectly in the end, they never did decode it correctly, mark the word wrong and do not provide the correct word. You go with whatever word they actually ended up with. Each passage will tell you the number of words that can be provided, which is 20% of the passage. So story 1, you can give 3 words, story 2, 8 words, story 3, 10 words, story 4, 20 words. Once again, do not stop the timer when you are providing a word during that 5 seconds or 10 seconds in the case of attempting to decode it. Okay, we looked earlier at when we were actually marking the miscues. Another way of doing this is a running record. So a running record just marks the word that has an error on it and does not give you the details of what kind of a miscue it was. It's better to do a miscue analysis, and I'm hoping you'll be able to do a miscue analysis. But if you can't keep up with your child is reading fast, at least get a running record. It's the same procedure. If the child pauses for 5 seconds and you provide the word, then you have to put a slash mark or decodes for 10 seconds. Also slash between words for additions or other kinds of errors. Additions mean if the child puts a word in that doesn't really exist in the text. So the child would read, the blue jay was not perched, and not is not in the actual sentence, so you would put a slash and write a slash there to indicate that a word was put in that didn't actually exist in the text. Miscue markings are the preferred method. So again, instead of perched, the child said sitting. Instead of the word the child said the. He was looking on the limb and he said at the water. So you put a slash for and write the word at, which was the substituted word. Here's the example of the word that was inserted that isn't really in the text. So you see that little caret is an indication that there's a word that was added, and so you write the word the up above. She was very thirsty. There's a circle around the word very. That means the child omitted the word, so the child read she was thirsty. So she flew down, and instead the child read the word as flied down. All right, so those are the miscues, and this is a miscue analysis, or a miscue recording, rather. All right, so the actual names for these: substitution. If the child substituted a word for the word that was in the text, you write the word above the intended word. Self-correction. Write the miscue followed by an arrow pointing to the corrected word. So when you look over here, the word unable, the child first said able, so you write that down, and then the arrow indicates that the child corrected that miscue without any prompts from you. Another way of marking instead of that arrow is to put a C around the word able, meaning that the child corrected that mistake. Omission, circle the omitted word. Addition, insert the caret, write the added words. Repetitions, underline repeated words. Reversals or transposed letters, or transposed letters or words. Let's race up to the mountain, shouted Danalia, but the child read, let's race up the mountain, Danalia shouted. So you put that little reversal signal around those two words. And it can be more than just two words. You can reverse a whole phrase. If the student drops a line, stop the timer, direct attention to the correct line, and count that as one error. So if the child skipped a whole line of text, do stop the timer, tell them where to start reading again, turn the timer back on, and count that as an error. You count off in the scoring for added words, incorrect words, mispronounced words, unless it's a dialect, omitted words, word substitutions, provided words, skipped lines, and word repetitions. You take off 1 point even if two words or a whole phrase are repeated. So these are the things that count off as errors. Okay. So now we've got our transcript of how the child read the passage and our indication of how many seconds it took the child to read that passage. So you record those numbers, so time in seconds, in this case 40 seconds, deviations from print or miscues, 4. All right, now you remove the student booklet and you ask the comprehension questions. So the child cannot go back and reread the passage to try to find the answers. You've removed the book, they cannot see the passage that they just read. Where does the story take place? And so if you look on the right, it gives you an indication of what the correct response is expected to be. And these are, each question is scored as either 1 point or 0 points. Okay. Comprehension decisions. If answer is one word and the student gives longer answer, ask for just one word answer, just a one word answer. So let's go back over here. What is the cat's name in this story? And if the child starts going on and on, well, I think that his name might have been Mimi, but there is another cat, something like that. You just say, just give me one word. That's a one word answer. Accept synonyms unless question asks for a specific word. So if they were supposed to tell you cat and they said kitty, then you allow kitty as an acceptable answer. Accept any of the answers presented on the list. Some questions will give allowable answers in italics, but don't read these to the child. And then you go to the bottom and you mark the total comprehension score. All right, now these need to be converted into the time scores and the deviation from print scores, okay? So when you look at the time that it took to read the passage, when you're looking for 40 seconds, which is what the child took to read the passage, then you look at that continuum and you'll see that under answer number or under rating score number 3, we see 36 to 51 seconds. So there's the child's actual score or time that it took in seconds to read the passage, and that corresponds to a 3. So we're going to put that 3 in the rate score box. Then we're going to do the same thing with deviations from print. So the child had 4 deviations from print. So look along that continuum, and you'll find again that 4 deviations from print also earned a rate accuracy score of 3. So I'm going to put that rate accuracy score of 3. So now we got a 3 for deviations from print and a 3 for the accuracy score. I'm going to add those two together. And that gives me a 6 for my fluency score. So we're going to transform those raw scores into a rate score, an accuracy score, and a fluency score. So you'll have those 3 converted scores. All right, how do you know where to stop and how do you know where to begin? The ending point is called the ceiling. The beginning point is called the basal. To calculate the basal and ceiling, only the fluency scores are used. And remember, the fluency score was the converted rate score plus the converted deviations from print score or accuracy score. And when I added those two together, I got the fluency score. That's the score that we're going to use for basal and ceiling. A basal is reached when scores of 9 or 10 are reached for 2 consecutive stories. This means the scores must be accurately computed during the testing to obtain the fluency score. The ceiling is reached when scores of 2 or less are reached for 2 consecutive stories, and that tells you when to stop. So again, this test is a little bit complex when you first start giving the test, because you have to get, calculate your deviations from print, calculate your rate, and calculate your comprehension questions. Then you have to convert the rate and the deviations from print into the rate and accuracy scores, and then you need to add those two together to give your fluency scores, and then you need to compare the fluency scores to these criteria. So let's go over the ceiling in a little more detail. You begin testing at your entry point, and that was what the appropriate entry level was for your child's grade level. Remember, only the fluency scores are going to be used, so you're going to calculate the fluency scores for each one of the passages and find the ceiling first. It's reached when scores of 2 or less are obtained for 2 consecutive stories. What about the basal? Testing takes a long time, children get tired, so basal is a mathematic means to shorten the test. Instead of starting all of the children with the first passage, you're going to start them at their entry level. That does not mean, however, that that's their basal, because that passage might have been too difficult, and you're going to have to ask them to read passages that are less difficult or below that entry level. So each story becomes progressively more difficult. If you start with a reading passage 1 year below the child's age grade level and read the next passage successfully, mathematically you can predict that all passages below that level would have been also successfully read. So the entry level is 1 year below the child's age or grade level, at least. Okay? So the test manufacturers have you start at that point that's at least a year below the child's age or grade level. If they can read that passage successfully, then you would assume, so they started on passage number 4. If they read passage number 4 successfully, then you would assume that they could have read passage 3, 2, and 1 successfully. So you give them credit for the points available for passage 3, 2, and 1, even though they never actually read those passages. They receive full credit for all passages below the basal, even though the passages were never read. And be real careful about that, because it's so easy to omit writing those credits down on the scoring form, and then when you get the norms for the child's undercredited, so the child gets a very low score, looks like a very poor reader, but actually it's because you forgot to add in those points that they would get below the basal. If the basal is never reached, it means nothing except that you had to go all the way back to the first passage and weren't able to take advantage of the shortcut. Okay, so once the ceiling is reached, basal, a fluency score of 9 or 10 for 2 stories. So that rate score plus the accuracy score had to equal more than 9 or 10 for 2 stories. On the example we looked at earlier, it was only 6, so that was not enough points to have achieved a basal. If the basal has not been reached, go back to earlier passages until a basal is reached or until the first passage is read. If a double basal is reached, the true basal is the one closest to the ceiling, and all points are given for the lower stories. That basically means you might have gotten a 9 or a 10 twice, then you got an 8, and then you got another place where you got a 9 or a 10. The second place where you got the 9 or 10 is the one that counts, and so the child is given full credit for the stories below that, even though you saw that the child only got an 8. All right, so this is what the scoring form is going to look like. There's your fluency score. So we're going to fill in our rate scores and our accuracy scores. So this child had an entry level of passage 4. They got a rate score of 4. They got an accuracy score for that passage of 5. And so that gives them a 9. They also got a comprehension score of 2. They read passage 5. They got a 5 for rate. They got a 4 for accuracy. That gave them another 9. They read passage 6. They got a 5 for rate, but only a 2 for accuracy, so now their fluency score is only a 7. They read passage 7. They got 1 for rate, 1 for accuracy, so their fluency score is only 2. They read passage 8. They got a 1 for rate, 0 for accuracy, so they really couldn't read the passage at all. And so they got a fluency score of 1. Now, we're only looking at that fluency score, and we're looking to see if there is a place where they got a 9 or a 10 for 2 stories. We're also looking for a ceiling where we stopped giving the test, and we're looking for a place where they got a 2 or less for 2 stories. So when we look at the last 2 stories, 7 and 8, they got a score of 2 or less for the 2 stories. This is our ceiling. That means we don't give them any more tests to read, any more passages to read. We stop the test. Now we want to see if we have a basal or if we have to read more stories on the easier end. So we look, and indeed we have 2 stories where we got 9s. And so that means we can assume that they would have gotten all of the points, or 10 points, if we would have had them read story 3. They would have gotten 10 points for reading story 2, and they would have gotten 10 points for reading story 1, even though we did not ask them to read any of those stories. We give them full credit for any stories below the basal. Now when we add these up, it's going to give us 10, 20, 30, 39, 48, 50. I'm not doing it correctly, I guess. It should come to a total of 53 according to their calculations. Okay. Now we're going to also add in the rate scores on the far left. So we're going to give them full credit for the rate scores, even though they never read those passages, and we're going to give them full credit for the accuracy scores, and we're going to give them full credit for the comprehension scores. And then we add those up and we get the figures in the bottom. All right. Let's do another. We're going to use our fluency scores. And we find that the child went all the way to the end of the test, 16 passages, and never reached a ceiling. They never got only 2 points. So again, a ceiling just tells you where to stop the test, and we never could stop the test. We just had to keep administering passages to this child until the very end of the test. So they were a very good reader. All right. And we look at their entry level, and they got 10 points for each of the 2 stories after the entry level. So that means we have our basal. That means that we're going to give them credit for all of the stories below story 6, even though they didn't read any of those stories. Oh, this is an example of a first basal. Okay, but when we look further into the test, there's another place where they got 9 or 10 twice. So the second basal is going to be our true basal, and that's the one we're going to count. So don't be fooled like I was by finding that first basal. There's actually another place where they also got a basal. 9 and 10 also were successful. But the highest one, or the one closest to the ceiling, was 12 and 13. Now that means you're not going to count off for any of the points below that level. So even though, watch this very carefully, even though they only got 7 points for number 11, it's below the basal, so they're going to get a full 10 points. They're going to get a full 10 points for test number 10, even though they actually only got a 9. They're going to get a full 10 points for number 9 and also for number 8. So those four stories that they only received something between 7 and 9 points, they're going to get the full 10 points because it's below the true basal. And that gives them a whopping score of 145. Make sure you understand that principle of a true basal. And now the same is going to be true for these other scores. They get what's going to be true is that they get the full 5 points for any of those that they didn't read. They get those points. It isn't going to change the scores for stories 6 through 11 because only the fluency score is used for basal and ceiling. Basal and ceiling are not found for comprehension. Instead, you just total all the comprehension points, 1 point per question answered correctly, 5 points for each unadministered passage below the basal. All right, a miscue analysis. So we had recorded the miscues on the form, whether they substituted words, mispronounced words, had reversals, added words, deleted words, repeated words, repeated lines, all of those things were counted in the miscue scoring. Now we're going to do an analysis. So this is a little more in-depth analysis of the errors. At least 2 stories must be marked to obtain a minimum of 25 miscues to analyze. So you're going to need, at least 2 stories, probably more, to get 22 miscues. And you do a qualitative analysis. So I look at my first word, perched, and the child said sitting. And now I'm going to ask myself some questions. Did it maintain a similarity in meaning? And the answer is yes. Did it maintain some functional similarity? Yes. Did it maintain phoneme-grapheme similarity? No. The words are synonyms for each other, but they have nothing to do with the actual spelling of the words. Are there multiple sounds? Yes. And was it self-corrected? No. All right, then we look at the second word, for the. Same thing. Yes, it's similar in meaning and function. Phonemes or the spelling, not at all the same. Did the child use multiple sources in order to come up with that miscue? Yes, they must have used grammar and meaning and function in order to come up with that substitution. Do they self-correct it? No. Next one, for, and they put at the. Does it have similar meaning? No, for is not the same as at the, but it does have similar function. So we're talking about prepositions or locations. Does it have grapheme phoneme similarity? No. So did they use multiple sources? No, they just used grammar to come up with that substitution. Okay, so basically this is how you do this miscue analysis, and it gives you a profile of what kinds of mistakes a child is making or why they're making some mistake. So actually this child is a pretty good reader. They do a pretty good job of maintaining meaning and function, but they're sometimes just retrieving a word that's similar to the word that they need without paying enough attention to the spelling of the word. And they rarely self-correct. All right. Well, once you totaled all of your scores, those are meaningless scores because you have no idea if a score of 145 or a score of 33 is good for a first grader or if it's bad for a first grader. Is it good for a sixth grader or is it bad for a sixth grader? You have no idea because they haven't been converted to a standard score or a score along the normal curve. So, first you have to calculate the chronological age and find the appropriate age group on the tables. There is a PowerPoint on Moodle that explains to you how to calculate a chronological age. So you find the child's chronological age, then you go to the tables and you find the child's chronological age on the table. And you use the score and the chronological age. Where those two intersect, it tells you what the standard score is. So you find the raw score under the child's chronological age, and that intersection will give you the child's standard score. And these can be percentile scores or quotient scores. You also can find age and grade age and grade equivalents that are available. These are useful when talking to classroom teachers, especially, as opposed to percentile scores or standard scores. Okay, so you convert it to a scaled score or a percentile. So if you look at our list of scores underneath this normal curve, the fourth one down is going to be a scaled score. A scaled score is going to have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. You can see that anything from 8 to 12 is going to be average. 6 and 7 below average, 4 and 5 poor, and in 2 and 3 very poor, etc. So this is one of the scores that you'll have a table for on the GORT, and also the percentile score. We talked about how percentile scores are pretty weak scores statistically, and that a stronger score to report would be the scaled score or the normal curve equivalency, the NCE, that's right above the percentile. There's the scaled score, there's the percentile score. Here's what the table looks like. So if your child was 7.6 years of age, or 7.8, we would go to where it says 7.6, and then you would find the actual raw score that the child got, and that intersection would give you the percentile score over on the left, or the scaled score over on the right. So if the child was 7.8 and they got a score of 22, they would be at the 63rd percentile and they would have a scaled score of 12. You can convert the sums of scaled scores to percentile ranks and indices using this table. So this one is, once you've got a converted score, then it doesn't matter what the child's age is because now you're dealing in mathematically standard scores. So you can sum those and you can get an oral reading index or a percentile rank for scaled score sums. So that means when you add together fluency and comprehension, the norms, the scaled scores, the scaled scores that you got for those, when you add those two together, you don't have to go to age calculations anymore. You can just go to this table. Here's tables for converting the raw scores to age equivalents. And then on the right, converting the raw scores to grade equivalents. This is why it's so important to have the correct chronological age calculated in the first place, because if you make a mistake on the chronological age, then basically you're reading the wrong normative table. It's also important that you follow the instructions for calculating the scores and making sure that you've given them credit for anything below the basal. Finally, the scale scores are going to be, well, the scale scores on the left, it's quotient scores in the middle. So you can take any of those standard scores and you can rate them according to the descriptive term. So if I get a scale score from 8 to 10, that's going to be 8 to 12, that's going to be average, 13 or 14 above average, 6 to 7 below average, etc. So these help people understand how to interpret these scores, whereas the scores themselves are a little confusing for people that are not familiar with the normal curve and standard scores. All right, so that's basically what we know about the Gray Oral Reading Test. You get a lot of quantitative information, meaning how your child performs compared to the national norms. Do they perform in a way that's superior, average, below average, very poor? And we also have some qualitative information in terms of the miscue analysis. So what kinds of errors are they making, and does that give you some insights into what the child needs? Do they need more work on decoding accurately? Do they need more work on making better predictions and paying more attention to maintaining meaning while they're reading instead of just word guessing? So basically the miscue analysis helps to give you some insights into the quality of the child's errors. All right, the basic reading inventory, on the other hand, is going to be very similar to the GORT, but it's going to be criterion referenced rather than norm referenced. We are not going to get any tables to look at that tells me that this child is going to be in the 13th percentile or have a scale score of 6 or 8. Okay, so this is the form that you're supposed to complete after doing the various tests on the basic reading inventory. So the first thing that you do is to read graded word lists. The GORT did not have graded word lists. So you have to go to a test like the basic reading inventory. Graded word lists are 20 words at each grade level, and you have the child read the words. So we can see that the first pre-primer, or the beginning of first grade, me, get, home, not, he, tree, girl, take, etc. Primer, or the middle of first grade, show, play, be, eat, did, brown, is, boat. And then finally the first grade level, here, down, then, how, saw, pocket, hello, and never. The words with the asterisk are dulce words. Dulce words are high frequency words. And those are words that occur with high frequency, whether it's first grade reading or college reading. So they're usually function words like is and are and be and play and those kinds of things. And those are words that the teacher has the children practice a lot. So you have the child has a booklet where they read the words, and you have this score sheet where you're marking down what the child reads and pronounces as they're supposed to go through the word list. You're going to mark if they sounded out the words, you're going to mark if they're reading very slowly, if they self-corrected, if they substituted a word. So you're doing that sort of a miscue analysis of the word lists. So you begin 1 year below the child's actual grade level. So if the child's completed first grade, then you're going to start at the pre-primer level. If they're just in first grade, you're going to start at that pre-primer level. If the child's a second grader, you're going to start at the first grade level. So you read about a year below the child's actual grade. You present the word list to the child while you score on the test form. So the child has just a word list without all of the blanks next to it. You put a check if the child reads the word rapidly and correctly. You write the initials SO if the child sounded out the word. You write the word or pseudo word if the child miscued. So if the child said, um, for the word book, they said Bach. Okay, then you would write the pseudo word Bach. Put a plus next to a miscued word if the child self-corrected the word. So if they said Bach and then they changed it to book, first you would write the word Bach and then you would put a plus next to it, meaning that they self-corrected it. Or you could put a C around the word. You total the number of correct words, and then you use the scoring guide to rate the word as list as being independent, instructional, or frustrational. So when I look at this one, if the child reads 19 to 20 of the words correctly, I would write 19 and then I would circle independent. If the child read 16 of the words correctly, I would write 16 and then I'd look at that middle column and I would see that 16 is instructional level. And if the child read 13 of the words correct, I'd write that under number correct, and I'd look at my guide and look at the far right column where it says 13 or less is frustration, so I would circle the frustration level. And I would do that for every one of the word lists until the child read the words at the frustration level, till that frustration level is reached. So the frustration level is the same thing as a ceiling. You stop when you get to the frustration level. If they haven't reached an independent level, so if the child was a second grader and you started with the passage or the grade 1 reading words and you got an instructional level, so they got 15 of the words right, but they have not reached the level of independence, then you would have to move back to the primer level. If they still didn't get independent reading for that level, then you'd move back to the pre-primer level. So basically, it functions kind of like a basal and a ceiling. Okay. Then you begin at the highest level where independent word recognition was attained. So if the child got word recognition for the second grade word list, then you would start with second grade reading. Okay, so there are 100 words in most of the passages. The very first pre-primer one has 50 words, so you would count 2 points off for each error. The rest of the passages have 100 words. So you count off 1 point per each reading miscue or error. The first no. Jack woke up Saturday morning. He looked out the window. The ground was white. The trees were white. So if the child makes any mistakes, you do the same kind of miscue marking that we did for the GORT. The child's reading from a book, and you're scoring on this form. You're going to use a stopwatch device, like the one on your phone, just like you do for the GORT, to keep track of the time it takes to read the passage. And you're going to be marking the miscues. You're going to score the words on the form, and then later you'll complete a miscue analysis just like you did for the GORT. And you're going to total the correct number of words. Okay, if you look at the scoring guide, there's a row of numbers across the top. And if you read the small print, it says % of word recognition in context. Okay, so you're going to use those numbers to tell you if the passage is being read at the independent level, the instructional level, or the frustration level. So you're going to say, okay, the child read 99% of the words correctly. That's an independent level. Now there's a little bit of gray area in there. So it says 98 to 96. If the child read very fluently but made 4 mistakes and got a 96, you might choose to rate that as independent reading. So the child was just reading very fluently and made some small errors. On the other hand, if the child was really struggling to read the passage and got a 96, then you would rate that 96 as instructional level. So there's judgment call that you can use when you're using a reading inventory. It's not just the number of words, but the fluency and speed and quality of the reading. So you're going to make those kinds of judgment calls, and you're going to rate each passage for the percent of words correct and also the level that you decide to assign to it, whether it's instructional, frustration, or independent. If not independent, you're going to back down and go to a lower level until the independent level is achieved. Then you continue on to higher passages until the frustration level, which is 90% or below, is reached. And again, that's would be, 10 errors or more. The codes for the miscues are pretty much the same as the GORT. So for substitutions, you write the word above the word. Omission, circle it. Insertion, put the caret. Self-correction, mark it with a C. Write the miscue and then mark it with a C. Reversal, do that little reverse sign, and punctuation ignored. You can mark an X on any punctuation that the reader produces. You can also underline any of the repetitions, although the repetitions and self-corrections are not counted as errors on this test. All right, and then step 3, we're going to look at the comprehension. The comprehension questions deal with topics, facts, inferences, evaluations, and vocabulary, and you can see those little alphabetical letters indicating whether it's factual, evaluation, or vocabulary on the left of the comprehension section. There's the comprehension question with the suggested answers, acceptable answers below. And again, you can use your judgment on whether the child's answer is an acceptable answer. What is the story about? Boys getting ready to play in the snow. On what day does the story take place? Saturday. Factual information. Why do you think the boys were so excited? This was an inferential question. So again, you're getting some qualitative information on what kinds of questions the child is having difficulty with. Okay, so following the passage reading, remove the test stimuli from the child's view. So that's just like the GORT. Make sure that they're not going back and rereading the passage to get the answers. The students' responses are scored as correct, 1 point, incorrect, 0 points, or partially correct, 0.5 points. So you are allowed to give partially correct answers on this one, which was not true of the GORT. Total number of correct answers, and then you go to the bottom to that scoring guide again, but this time you're going to use the numbers at the bottom. So below where it says independent, instructional, or frustration, there's another row of numbers, and those are the ones that you use to rate comprehension. If it's not independent, back down to a lower level until the independent level is reached. So you do want to find an independent decoding level and an independent comprehension level. Continue to the higher levels or until frustration, 50% or fewer correct answers is reached, or frustration for word recognition is reached, but not both. So frustration is when the child reaches the frustration point for either the decoding or the comprehension, but you do not continue until it's reached for both. Then you analyze the miscues. They call a significant miscue one that changes the meaning of the sentence. All right. Now, in terms of profiling what you have, this is an informal way of doing it for pre and post test. So basically, you write down the reading levels that the child attempted, PP, P1 and 2, and then there are columns for whether they read that in terms of sight words, whether they read them independently, instructional, or frustrational. So you can see the profile. This child read the PP passage into the PP words independently, primer words instructionally, and then was frustrated at both first and second grade level. At post-test, okay, several months later, the child now could read both the PP and the PP words at an independent level, had moved up to the instructional level for the first grade words, and had moved close to the instructional level for second grade words. So again, it gives you a nice way of looking at progress across time. This is the same thing only for word recognition passages, and finally the same thing for comprehension. And you can see comprehension continuing to improve across time as well. This is the actual form that is suggested by the BRI. So the current reading level of the child was second grade, and you can see in that first area that the child had read 18 of the 20 words. 2 of them were sounded out, and so that placed the child at the independent level. Gave the child a total of 20 words because the sounded out words were counted as correct, and that's considered independent. Then they read 11 of the words quickly. They sounded out 5 additional words at the P level. That gave them a total of 16, which is at the instructional level. Then they read 11 words with 4 sounded out. That gives them 15, which was at the instructional level. And at the second grade level, they read 8 words, 2 sounded out, which gave them, it should have been a 10, which would have been a frustration level. Okay. Then you do the same thing for the contextual passages. They made 1 error, that was independent. They made 7 errors, that was instructional. They made 11 errors, that was frustrational. Then you can do the same thing for comprehension. And then you do the same for reading rate, which does not have any designation of frustration, independent, or whatever. That's just a qualitative type of thing. Okay, you can't put a comparison of pre and post on the same form for this one. This is just a single administration of the test. What you can do, however, is give a sort of summary or an estimate of the overall reading level based on your analysis of those things. Okay, you also can give, there are many forms on the BRI. There's, at least 4 different forms that are roughly equivalent to each other. So I can give one as an oral reading that the child does, and I can do another as a silent reading, which is called the listening level. So you basically ask the child the question, have the child read the passage silently, and then you ask the questions, and that gives you a listening level. So now you can compare the child's listening level to the child's oral reading and comprehension level. And you can see that when the child read the passage orally, they were independent at the P level, instructional at the independent at the PP level, instructional at the P level, and frustrated at the first grade level. But when I gave them a listening comprehension, they were independent for first and second grade, and then frustrated at the third grade level. So basically that's telling me that the child was making all of those mistakes at the oral reading level because they can't actually read very well. But if they were able to read it, they could comprehend it. So my general observations: slow reader, often word by word, stops frequently to sound out words, but limited decoding skills. Comprehension is grade appropriate for listening level, suggesting low scores for oral reading comprehension are related to weak word recognition. And then I have a place where I can also do a sort of profile of miscues. So this test basically is a qualitative, but it's much more qualitative. It allows you to do a variety of different kinds of things and analyze the reading several different ways. So you end up with a lot of qualitative information rather than quantitative scores. It doesn't tell you you're at the 10th percentile or the 50th percentile or have a standard score of 110 or a score of 10. It basically is all comparing criteria of here's the difficulty of the reading passage and here's what the child did at that level of reading. So they have different purposes and different functions, the criterion reference versus the norm reference test, and both are important, and both are important tools in our battery. All right, so that's how we give the reading tests. The manuals are posted on Moodle, so if you need to go back and study them more carefully, do so and be ready to give the test to the kids.